Younger people in particular are, I would say, essentially becoming native AIs at this point in time.
As a general thesis, all AI projects that start in the IT department fail.
Today, I have to think about things in a completely different way. That means I also have to say, in the past, we used to say mobile first, but today I have to say AI first.
I believe no company today can afford not to deal with the topic of AI. Yes, a warm welcome to all our listeners and viewers to a new episode of Digital Decoded on the podcast. Mario, we have a really exciting topic in my opinion. Actually, we always have exciting topics. Mario, I'm not even sure if we always say this at the beginning, but probably we do. But that somehow shows just how passionate we are about what we do. And the topic we want to tackle today is the current state of AI tools in companies. What's possible, what isn't, and which tool is best for what. And to begin our discussion today, I have a question for you, dear Mario. In your opinion, are many companies stuck between hype and helplessness?
Oh, yes, I definitely think so. I think we are ourselves too. Good point, André. Yes, I mean hype and helplessness. Let's start with the hype. Everyone knows they have to use AI. Everyone knows something is happening there. I simply can't do without it. And if I don't do it, I'll be disrupted. Sometimes I call it a bit of a headless chicken syndrome. Everyone is doing something. Everyone has started or is running 94 different POCs. And this brings us, of course, to helplessness. Many people don't know what will actually come out of it. Did it achieve anything? Did I set it up correctly? To be fair, there's also a lack of experience in some areas. And at the end of the day, it all comes down to two things. Often, what's missing is a strategy itself, an AI strategy, and the operationalization. And maybe a third topic, enabling people. Yes, and these are, of course, topics that fall into that category.
Mario, you just said that it often fails because of the AI strategy. And I don't know if you see it the same way, that in many companies there are a huge number of proof of concepts. So there's a lot of experimenting, different tools are being used here and there. From your perspective, what do you think is the right approach? Bottom up, top down, or a combination of both? How would you see it?
Well, starting with the strategy, it has to come from the company leadership. And as we've discussed in another episode, that's often where things fall short. To be fair, most company leaders often have no real understanding of AI. Of course, there are sometimes very, very good entrepreneurs, but who actually sits on company boards these days? They're often finance people and then often also lawyers, and sometimes there's a salesperson or a business manager. But still, even though there are a lot of different initiatives, there are still, unfortunately, very few women serving on boards and supervisory committees. That means it's still the old white gentleman. And that's not exactly the typical character who usually deals with AI a lot on a daily basis and in a hands-on way. And I think that's where our challenge lies, because from the top, the directive comes, we need to deal with this, do something about it. And then I'll say the CDO comes in, who often isn't even a member of the board, and he comes back with all these great ideas. Suddenly he says, oh, we need to invest in this and this will disrupt this and that. And then, of course, the finance people come in and say, oh, but that seems risky. Should we really do this? And what about data protection? Oh dear, what could possibly happen? And then if a customer comes around the corner and files a lawsuit or something else happens, that's such a typical German discussion. That's also why, in my view, we're just so slow. In many cases, by the way, medium-sized companies find this much, much easier than some large corporations. But if you look at America, we've often had this discussion, things just happen much, much faster there. There's not so much fuss made about it.
Yes, I see it exactly the same way. So that means anchoring an AI strategy at the executive management level. From your perspective, that's not only sensible, but also necessary. I would agree with that 100% because I think we discussed this in another episode as well. If you don't do that, if it's just individual employees dealing with it on their own initiative, which is of course very commendable, but then it usually goes wrong because the complexity of the different AI tools increases. I always use the example of private streaming accounts. If you're a series junkie these days, you need Netflix, then Amazon, then Paramount, then Disney, and maybe even more. And at the end of the month, you suddenly realize, wow, this is actually really expensive. It's similar with AI tools. Maybe we'll talk more about that in a moment. But the integration of the AI strategy into the overall company strategy is important. I see it exactly the same way. And it's not just about this bottom-up process, or not only about this bottom-up process. I have another point, Mario. I think it was just yesterday that I read an article, because there's always this discussion about which employees will be replaced by AI. And this article assumes that it will especially affect younger employees, not the older ones. That caught my attention at first, so I kept reading. The thesis is that, of course, and you and I both know this, when we started our careers, we first did a lot of routine tasks, right? To learn the processes, to understand the context and the complexity and so on. So the thesis is, if these routine tasks now disappear, if the technology, the AI takes over, how are younger employees supposed to learn all that in the first place? What's your take on that?
I think, as is often the case with these bold theses, there's a lot of marketing involved. It just gets more attention that way. On the other hand, you also have to say that younger people deal with these things very differently. We can see that the working world today, people often talk about it being hybrid, has completely changed. The pace is different, and especially younger people are, I would say, native AI users by now, because every smartphone nowadays has some kind of AI component, so they're growing up with it in a completely different way. In comparison, of course, older employees have to adapt. But I also find the thesis interesting. I don't think they'll disappear either, because experience counts and critical thinking is probably much more deeply rooted there. We need to protect and support that as well. But let's take classic experts, those with a lot of experience. In many companies, not just our own, these people are totally overloaded because everyone has fewer employees, but the workload stays the same or even increases. In that sense, there's also a huge opportunity here because everyone always talks about the risks of AI. The opportunity is simply to relieve employees and, of course, to allow young people to.
I agree with that. And we already discussed this in one of our previous episodes, that involving employees, anchoring it in the corporate strategy, but also taking into account the needs and everyday challenges of employees and incorporating them into this implementation is extremely important. And we've also discussed before that leadership changes, that culture changes to some extent in order to really make AI projects successful within a company. So we also discussed in a previous episode how important prompt engineering is, and how paradoxical it actually is that now I suddenly have to know how to talk to a machine and exactly what kind of prompt I need to use. We've already talked about that. But Mario, there are also hurdles when it comes to introducing AI in companies. What is your observation on this?
I think the first hurdle is usually the human factor, in the sense that we tend to think in a complicated way at first, and we think about risks, and we immediately consider everything that could go wrong. And at least in Germany, we also think about what legal consequences there might be, and so on and so forth. So I would say there was once this commercial for Opel with the slogan, "Change your mindset." Yes, and I think that's a very important factor. We actually discussed this in one of our previous episodes as well. I have to think about things in a completely different way today. That means, whereas in the past people used to say mobile first, now I have to say AI first. In the past, it was also often said that you have to think from the customer's perspective and build a customer centric company. I believe that in the medium term, the companies that will be very successful are those that have an AI centric approach and really, with every consideration they make, ask themselves how AI can help them and how AI can create added value for them. And I think now we're coming back to the point about POCs that you mentioned earlier. This is a huge topic. What are the real added values? Yes, and how do we get there? Because one mistake that I think is often made, just as a final point from my side, is that people often don't pick the simple things that can be implemented quickly and immediately provide added value. Instead, in typical German fashion, we feel we have to take on something really difficult, something medium, and something easy. And then we say, look, the difficult one, AI couldn't handle that. AI is stupid. And that's a completely wrong approach. I actually believe that the greatest added value from AI, especially in routine tasks, comes from handling the easy and medium difficulty tasks. Let's just set aside the really difficult, complex ones for now. Those are where the experts we just talked about are needed.
Absolutely. And that's a really great example. I have a client where we implemented an AI strategy, including all the R&D topics, that is research and development topics, that have been accumulated over 150 years. We essentially fed this knowledge to the AI in order to transfer the expertise from the few experienced, mostly very senior employees to a broader base. And something really interesting happened there, Mario. They tried to find out through prompting, that is by asking questions, what this chatbot, which was ultimately a chatbot at the end of the day, couldn't do. So, and that's an intriguing question. Yes, and instead of asking the question, okay, where can it help me and how can I use it as a kind of sparring partner to some extent? That's one thing. And the second thing I noticed was that they use the chatbot to search for things, which is understandable at first. But as you know yourself, if we were to ask, say, the famous AI tools to tell us something about the podcast Digital.Decoded, even with the same technology, we'd get different answers. And with different technologies, that effect is multiplied, of course. Yes, so it's also about developing this mindset that it's a sparring partner, that I still have to use my own brain, and that generative AI generates rather than searches. From my point of view, that's a very important mindset shift.
But that's a great example, and that's what I meant when I said that as humans, we're actually the disruptive factor here. Yes, and then we immediately have that fear again, the one we had at the beginning, that AI will make humans redundant and so on. I think a lot will probably happen eventually, but it's also a gradual process. But I also want to give you a nice example which ties into what you just said. A friend of mine has many, many years of experience at the top level as a consultant in the chemical industry. And in chemistry, of course, you have to do a lot of research and you also have to master these chemical processes and so on. They developed a solution that using AI practically simplifies and improves these lab processes tremendously. And now he was just telling me about his frustration because they've done 15 pitches to companies and all 15 said, "This is a great solution. We really should use it." But then they all said, well, we need to take 3 or 4 months to reflect and try to find some use case where we might be able to use this and then figure out if the AI actually does it better than what we've been doing ourselves. And he said to me, and I found this quite telling, he said to me, and he's a really smart guy, also a doctor, so he really has a lot of experience and knowledge. He said, well, the most obvious approach, and this is the suggestion I always make, is to say, just give us some data from things you've already done, things that maybe took you 3 or 4 months, and we'll take that data, feed it into the AI, and see how long the AI takes to do it. It would probably only take you 5 days. That means you'd have a huge advantage in terms of cost and time. But interestingly, companies aren't willing to do that because then it might turn out that with the way everything is currently set up, even though it all seems so great, the organization is actually much too slow and too expensive.
And too expensive. So that means there's something really, really important here. As we mentioned earlier, company strategy. We want to do this, not just we should maybe do this, but we want to do this. It needs to be anchored in the AI strategy. And then you really have to put the power and the will behind it to actually make something happen. Yes, and you just brought up the topic of data again, which we've already discussed before. Of course, I need data and it has to be in good shape, to put it simply. And I mean, the advantage of language models is that maybe I don't always need the most perfectly structured data anymore, but I still have to keep my data in order. And that's something you need to factor into your considerations as well. I have another question, Mario, and maybe it's a provocative statement, but I'll just say it. As a provocative thesis, all AI projects that start in the IT department fail. What's your take on that?
I don't think that's true, but I also couldn't give you any numbers on how many are actually successful. But I do know of some that started in IT and have been successful. But, and this is where the but comes in from my perspective. You always have to carefully evaluate these AI tools or solutions you want to establish, considering the added value and potential impact they provide. And well, I know of two types of AI projects that started in IT. One is we want to test out a technology and we do it to practically evaluate the technology, or we say, I want to achieve a specific added value because there are also many people in IT who are very involved with the business side. I've noticed there's a problem, and from my IT experience, I actually know there's an AI tool that can solve this problem. And when I approach it with this solution oriented mindset, those are exactly the projects that end up being successful.
Projects.
And I think the same applies to the business side.
Absolutely. And I think that's a crucial point. I mean, the thesis was bold and doesn't apply to every company, but it always applies when these pilot projects remain solely within IT. Yes, and if the business perspective isn't included, if it doesn't become a strategy, in the same way, you could say that if an AI proof of concept is carried out exclusively in the business department, then, for example, you don't consider topics like IT strategies, data protection, compliance, or other guidelines. So there has to be collaboration within the company. I see that. I absolutely see that. Now, how I have
A bold thesis, my dear.
André, I'm actually quite curious.
Yes, and the question or thesis statement for you to consider is this: does AI bring any added value? What's your take on that? How are companies dealing with this? Measuring their added value through AI, and does AI demonstrably bring added value?
Yes. And I think that's truly the question of all questions. If you look at various studies and research papers, the results really do vary quite a bit, from quantifiable, measurable added value in different areas and sectors to responses like, we haven't really found it yet, we're still a bit stuck in helplessness, which honestly is something we had at the very beginning and also during the initial hype phase. I believe the added value becomes apparent whenever I do certain things or when I approach specific tasks with an open mind. First of all, I think no company today, regardless of its size or industry, can truly afford not to deal with the topic of artificial intelligence or AI in some meaningful way. Of course, every company wants to have added value, whether that's expressed in cost reduction, productivity, increased revenue, and so on. Then you need to identify the relevant areas for this. As you mentioned earlier, it's important to start small and not always think big. Start small and ask, how can I make this added value clear? And above all, how can I bring employees along so that they also recognize this added value? I think that's a very, very important point to get started. The more I engage with these topics, the more apparent this added value becomes. There are great examples from clients I've worked with. I'm sure your company has seen this too, where they started small. Yes, sometimes it's an intensive and demanding process, but if you consistently involve different perspectives, not just IT, not just business, but various departments, then I always see added value. That's my opinion. Do you see it differently?
I have the same perspective, but the question is, how do I quantify that? I get asked that a lot, and there are certainly benchmarks from well known consultants like McKinsey or BCG, or, for example, from Salesforce or other providers in the market. And I think they really hit the nail on the head. Of course, those are always average values, but if we talk specifically about what AI actually delivers, you can say, for example, in sales, since we're also talking about sales and targeting audiences here, if I improve my targeting with AI, then my closing rate can definitely increase by 5%. Some benchmarks, even McKinsey, for example, talk about 15 to 25%, but let's stay conservative. From my experience, you can definitely increase the rate by 5, maybe even 10%. The second point is, as you mentioned, one aspect is added value, but the other is cost reduction. The time spent on cold calling can be reduced by 20 to 30%, and that happens very quickly. Then there are repetitive tasks that can be automated, so you quickly gain a time advantage or even achieve a 100% time saving. For example, here's an anecdote. We have an AI solution that is used by insurers, and if you, for example, write an email to an insurer, which many people still do, then say you report a claim, and in the same email you mention, by the way, I noticed you have a great new rate. Could you send me an offer? And by the way, I've moved. So today, when you do that for a customer, let's say it's a large insurer, they have 1,000 people globally who look at these things manually, right? Exactly. And now, a very concrete example. Our solution does this completely automatically with AI. And here's the crux, here's the anecdote. It does this within 60 seconds. Within 60 seconds, the AI formulates an email and sends it back to the customer saying, hey, I've looked at your case. By the way, this is such and such a claim, which is covered by your policy. Thank you. We'll take care of the offer. And third, I've already updated your address change in our system. It's already recorded. Now, here comes the anecdote. In these projects, because the AI is so good, you actually have to build in a delay because as a customer, you're totally confused if your issues are resolved so quickly. Today, you're used to insurers taking 3 or 4 weeks before you get a solution, and the AI does it in 60 seconds. That's insane. I think that's really cool, and it makes my heart leap. Of course, 60 seconds might be a bit much, but it really shows the added value and the speed you can achieve. You can use people differently, not necessarily to cut jobs, but to use them in new ways. After all, these are all well qualified people, generally speaking.
And
And of course, the third point is that you have much higher overall customer satisfaction, which is huge.
And that's a great example that you actually have to build in a delay. I find that a remarkable example. It's just spot on. And I think what's also important, Mario, since you asked, man, how does the added value come about? And I think From my observation, the companies that really gain significant added value don't just invest in technology, but also in people, in cultural change, in leadership, yes, in concrete use cases, deriving what it means for each individual. I think that's also a really, really important point, not just investing in the introduction of technology, but also investing in people.
That's one point. But there are also organizational changes that can happen as a result. They don't have to, but they can. You probably know this too. We have many, many clients, especially international ones, who, of course, have customers from different countries speaking different languages who call in somewhere. I mean, we're all Lufthansa or Eurowings customers. We've all flown with them at some point. So when you call their service center, you always get asked, is it okay if we serve you in English or does it have to be German? And then you get routed somewhere. It's the same with the big car manufacturers or the telecom companies and so on. Then people are sitting together somewhere in Bratislava or somewhere even cheaper, ideally to take your call in your language. And nowadays, there are also AI solutions that translate the language in real time. And I find that super exciting in terms of potential. Because that brings me back to my favorite topic. As a customer, you can speak in your native language, and the person on the other end doesn't have to know your language or even necessarily learn it. Yes, and of course, that's always an advantage, but all of that will disappear in the future, and that's really incredible.
Yes, I mean, from my point of view, Mario, it just shows what huge potential there is for companies. I mean, we've just touched on a few areas and the potential there. And I think, as we said, Mario, no company can really afford not to deal with AI. But if you do deal with it, then it needs to be anchored in the company's strategy. Yes, then I don't just need to invest in the technology, but also in the people, and then you need concrete use cases. Mario, you brought up another great point saying, well, let's not start with the hardest thing right away, but maybe let's start with something simple to anchor it, to see the impact, and to have positive experiences of success, which I find incredibly, incredibly important. And I think what we both see in companies, Marion, please correct me if I'm wrong, is a great enthusiasm, a strong motivation to engage with the topic. But at the same time, of course, also the question, how do I implement it? Yes, and how do I make it successful? So, and I think if you just take a few ingredients with you and say, I need to focus on technology, I need to focus on people, I need to focus on strategy, I need to start small, then that's a very important success factor, which we, of course.
One more point, Andre, that I'd like to bring up, and you just touched on it, the topic of execution. For example, if we take a use case that can be implemented quickly and also brings significant added value, what many people don't do is consider, when I actually want to execute and implement it later, how many people will it affect? In my experience, it often happens that when you really want to roll it out, you might have employees, and each employee would need a license for this tool. And then people often say, but Jomu, it does bring added value, but I think we'd rather not do it after all because we haven't budgeted for it. So you really need to think ahead, even with the smaller, simpler things.
I agree with you 100%, absolutely. Mario, there's one topic we couldn't cover today, but we'll save that for a future episode. Of course, another important question is, which tool should I actually use now? So, for example, Copilot, OpenAI, Grok, Gemini, as well as others, so on and so forth. What should I use now? And I think, dear viewers, dear listeners, we'll take that as a topic for one of the next episodes. At this point, I'd like to thank you, Mario, for the exciting discussion. But of course, I especially want to thank all of you for listening to us, for watching us. And please feel free to leave comments and give us feedback so that we can address the topics that are really important to you in one of the upcoming episodes. And until then, all that's left for me to say is stay human.